Our third speaker in this session is Deputy Commissioner Katie Miller from the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission here in Victoria. Katie is the Deputy Commissioner at IBAC, focused on IBAC's police jurisdiction. In her role, she supports IBAC to ensure that Victoria police officers exercise their powers with integrity and according to the law, and in doing so helps to strengthen community confidence in Victoria Police. She's had 15 years' experience in the public sector, initially as a lawyer and later as a senior executive. She is a Law Institute of Victoria accredited specialist in administrative law, a former president of LIV, an occasional radio host on 774, that's the ABC here, and is studying a PhD on whether administrative law is fit for the technology age. Please welcome Deputy Commissioner Miller.
Thank you. In my career, I've had the opportunity to work on a Royal Commission twice. I worked for a brief time on the Bushfires Royal Commission, held after the devastating Black Saturday bushfires here in Victoria in 2009. Although my involvement in that commission was brief and limited, it nevertheless had an effect on me. Some years later, an opportunity arose to work on the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sex abuse. And I mentioned it to my husband and that I was thinking of applying. And his response, he looked at me and he said, "Why do you want to do this? Why do you keep putting your hand up to look into tragedy?" And I looked back at him and I said, "Honey, we don't do Royal Commissions into puppies and kittens." When a Royal Commission is announced, it means something bad has happened that our ordinary institutions of government cannot deal with. Rationally, no one wants a Royal Commission, and that includes the lawyers. They are a necessary part of the way that we as a society process and come to understand how and why something bad has happened. Now, this could be seen as a relatively recent understanding of the role of Royal Commissions. Scott Prasser has identified 10 basic reasons for holding a Royal Commission, only one of which is responding to a crisis situation. Other reasons include essentially policy issues, defining policy problems, providing government with a broader range of policy options, reviewing existing programs and policies, and resolving public controversy. And these policy forms of Royal Commission were certainly regular features of the Australian landscape in the early years of Federation. Their need has become somewhat reduced as the institutions of government have developed and expanded. And in particular, now that we have permanent independent policy commissions such as the Productivity Commission, Law Reform Commissions, and, well, up until recent times, the Administrative Review Council, we have less need for Royal Commissions. Similarly, the growth of the integrity branch of government, comprising many of the bodies represented at this conference, means that there are also plenty of bodies that can review existing programs and organisations. And so against this relatively mature framework of institutional bodies, the need for a Royal Commission should be rare, and it should be used only to respond to a crisis. And no one wants a crisis. So how do we avoid the crisis and the subsequent need for a future Royal Commission? Now, where the crisis is one of corruption in government, I would say, and I think a lot of people here would agree, that everyone has a role to play. But this afternoon I want to focus on the role of anti-corruption commissions. In some ways, anti-corruption commissions can be seen as the last line of defence before a Royal Commission. If we detect corruption early enough, it can be investigated and dealt with within existing resources. Increasingly sophisticated technologies and investigative methodologies increase our abilities to detect and expose corrupt conduct earlier. However, that still largely relies on dealing with the problem after it has arisen. If we not only want to avoid Royal Commissions, but also the crises and problems that give rise to the need for them, then we must look to prevention as well as cure. So how do we as anti-corruption commissions use prevention to ensure that we don't need a Royal Commission in the future? Prevention largely seeks to address the underlying causes or drivers of a problem or crisis. Systems, structures and processes are common targets for prevention activities, and they're also common focal points for the recommendations that both Royal Commissions and anti-corruption commissions deliver. Essentially, fix the system, fix the problem. And yet the repetition of royal commissions in some spheres shows us that that's not always the case. And I think the recent Banking Royal Commission is a good case in point. No sooner had the 1,100 pages of the report landed on the desk of the Commonwealth Treasurer than commentators and industry experts were prophesying that we'd be back here again, possibly within the decade. And this pessimistic outlook can be attributed to the fact that while the Commission made many sensible recommendations as to systems and processes, it had not sufficiently tackled the cultural drivers that some saw as dooming to failure the systems and processes. And that's my main point today, that successful commissions, whether they be royal or anti-corruption, not only change systems and processes, they change cultures. Now, I should say that I prepared these remarks before I heard Professor Klitgaard's presentation yesterday, at which he suggested that culture should not be the focus of anti-corruption efforts. And I have reflected on those comments, and I do believe that our positions are reconcilable, especially if we understand what we mean by culture. Now, I understand culture to be less about value systems and more about the collective habits of people, the accumulation of everyday actions, which I think is consistent on Professor Klitgaard's suggestion that we focus on behaviours. Having said that, though, I don't think that values and hearts and minds are entirely irrelevant. For a public sector with ever-increasing responsibilities and never enough resources, changing values and changing hearts and minds actually has a cold, hard economic reality. The fact is that it's cheaper to motivate someone to behave in the way that we want them to if that aligns with their values and they think it's important, than it is to enforce it through compliance and oversight. To be very blunt, while harder in the short term, changing values and culture pays dividends in the long run. And when I look back on the Royal Commissions of, say, the past 45 years that I think are successful, I think one of the most powerful things they did was change culture and values in the community, in the sense of our understanding of what certain conduct is and whether it is tolerated as a mere moral failing or whether it is indeed considered criminal. And when I look at those sorts of Royal Commissions, I think of the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse, and the Fitzgerald Royal Commission. These commissions not only changed the way we approach these issues as matters of public policy and administration, they changed the way we understand the dark stains on our communities of family violence, child sex abuse and corruption in government. They changed the way that we identified these things, our understanding of what they look like and our appetite for recurrence. In short, the success of these Royal Commissions is seen in the tolerance we have for these behaviours, as in, we no longer have a tolerance for these behaviours. Now, one of the tools that can help a Royal Commission to achieve cultural change is time. And I think if we look at the Royal Commissions I've mentioned, Child Sex Abuse Royal Commission had 5 years, Fitzgerald had 3. Family Violence was relatively brief, only 13 months, but that actually gives commissions time to get beyond the shock and awe of the tragic cases and to actually start to have those conversations with communities that shift expectations and understandings. Now, as permanent commissions, anti-corruption commissions are not faced with the same time constraints and expiry dates of royal commissions. And that means that we've got the opportunity to have the conversations, to build the relationships, to try things, to adapt them, to fail a little bit, to have another go again. Because cultural change is never linear and it requires constant engagement and commitment. And so to avoid the next Royal Commission, anti-corruption commissions need to be in it for the long game, and we need to understand what that game is. And that game is not about systems and processes alone, it is about culture. In terms of what we as agencies can do, we are not going to be responsible for the culture of the agencies we oversee. Just as agencies must remain responsible and accountable for their systems and processes, so too will they be the ultimate people with responsibility for the cultures. However, just as we provide support around processes and policies, so too can we support cultural change. It does require planning. Cultural change is difficult. It can't just be reduced to a single recommendation. Instead, it is in the everyday acts that we have with the agencies that we oversee. In my view, every single time we communicate with an agency, whether it be in writing, orally, one-way, two-way, that is an opportunity to be influencing and shaping that agency's culture. And I think that increasingly we need to have more two-way conversations with the agencies that we oversee. We need to engage with them. We need to understand how they experience the problem and actually listen to the ways that they see the world. When I go to present to managers and recruits at the Police Academy, I'm always accompanied by a member of our prevention and communications team, because what we hear from police members is just as important as what I tell them. This sort of meaningful, continued engagement that focuses on culture takes time and often years. And I think that the great work that's been done by both Victoria Police and the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission in addressing sexual harassment and sexual discrimination in Victoria Police demonstrates the sort of cultural change that you can achieve through sustained and focused engagement. Internally within anti-corruption commissions, this sort of engagement does need some thinking and some planning. If our activities are not coordinated, then they can cut across each other, which not only undermines their effectiveness, but also can be quite confusing for the agencies that we oversee. And also, at the end of the day, we can't be engaging with everyone about everything all the time. So we are going to need to prioritise and really think about what are the crises and the problems that we're trying to prevent. I also think we're going to need to get a little bit more comfortable with the idea that anti-corruption commissions can be that critical friend, this idea of how can we help. 30 years after Fitzgerald, we're very comfortable with the idea of anti-corruption commissions as investigators, auditors and reviewers, and I think we're developing our understanding of how we can be a critical friend while maintaining independence. And that means that we need to be transparent, and we also need to be open to feedback from people about whether we've gone too far, not just from the agencies that we oversee, but also the public. Now, as I often say to members of Victoria Police, we won't stop bad things happening. Crises will continue. We'll still need royal commissions. But by using engagement as a tool to influence and shape cultures, we can reduce the need for royal commissions about corruption in government and police misconduct. And we can then reserve the royal commissions for the things that are truly intractable in our society, like controversy in the banking industry. Thank you.